Hey, what's up, DBU? So we're gonna finish our lecture from Tuesday. We'll be finishing chapter 2, and I'll be posting homework for this that'll be due on Friday. Um, Alrighty, so in chapter 2, we've been looking at, I changed the title from organic macromolecules to the chemical building blocks of life, just because it sounds more, it sounds cooler. But we're looking exactly at that, at what at the molecules that life is built out of. And these are organic macromolecules. So we already looked at two of those. We're looking at four of them. We already looked at two of those in the Tuesday lecture, which were carbohydrates and nucleic acids. So if you weren't there on Tuesday or you need to brush up, you can go to our slides that are on our blackboard and brush up on that. The other two that we're going to look in this online lecture are proteins and lipids. So proteins, like nucleic acids and carbohydrates, are polymers. So they're made up of repeating units. And in this case, proteins are a chain of multiple amino acids. So amino acids would be the monomers in this protein polymer, right? Remember, the monomer is the unit that is repeated many times to form a polymer. And the amino acids in a protein will interact with one another to give a protein its final shape. So as you can see in the picture here of a protein, this isn't a great picture of a protein, but it does show you that it's a chain of amino acids. So it's like a little snake, right, made up of many amino acids. At first it's like a spaghetti, a straight spaghetti, and then the amino acids are going to interact with each other, and the protein's going to start folding and taking on a three-dimensional shape. It's not going to end up looking like the picture that you have here on the slide. It's actually going to be a lot more compact and solid, and we'll see a few examples of this when we look at movies. We'll look at a movie on this lecture and also in lectures to come of DNA replication and protein synthesis. We'll get to actually see three-dimensional representations of proteins. And the shape of a protein is really important. All right, the shape that the protein has is going to determine the function of the protein. So if you were to go into a toolbox and look at a bunch of tools that you've never seen before, even if you don't know what it does, you could look at the tool, look at its shape, and kind of get an idea of what it does by its shape, right? Maybe it looks like another tool you've seen before, or you can kind of tell like, it looks like this tool does this certain function. It's the same thing with the protein. So proteins, again, it's a chain of amino acids that fold and take a certain shape. And that shape is what allows it to do what it does. And proteins are the workers of the cell. They're the ones, when you think of activity within a cell, of a cell doing something, think of a protein. Proteins are the ones that are doing the activity of the cell, the work in a cell. And they have a ton of diverse functions. So breaking down food, in your mouth, you have enzymes, which are typically proteins. You have enzymes that break down the food in your mouth, right? The bread that you put in your mouth is broken down as soon as it hits your saliva. And then once you ingest it, there's proteins and enzymes in your stomach that are in charge of breaking food down into smaller units. The synthesis of DNA, RNA, and protein, so building these molecules, these molecules are built by proteins. Proteins are like the assembly machines of the cell. Proteins are also involved in relaying messages within the cell, which is referred to as signaling. A lot of times cells communicate with one another by sending a signal from one cell to another, and the receiving cell is going to pick up that signal using a protein on the surface of the cell called a receptor. And then that protein will relay the message from the surface of the cell to the nucleus where the DNA is. And like I just said, proteins are also involved in signaling between cells. So think of neurons, for example. The neurons in your brain, they communicate with one another by releasing proteins called neurotransmitters. And these neurotransmitters, they relay the message to another cell. And that's how nervous impulses get relayed from cell to cell. Proteins also transport molecules in and out of the cell. They turn genes on or off, and they also turn other proteins on or off. So as you can see, proteins have a lot of functions within the cell. And like we just looked at, proteins are made up of amino acids. And so here is a figure of one amino acid. Remember, there's 20 different ones that will all link together to form a protein. And amino acids have three main groups that are bonded to a central carbon. So you can see here on the left is an amino group, on the right is a carboxyl group, and on the top is a side group. And these are all bonded to a carbon in the center, which is also bonded to a hydrogen. All right. And an amino group, amino simply means that there's a nitrogen in there, and a nitrogen bound to hydrogens. That's literally what an amino group is. A carboxyl group, by definition, is this carbon double bonded to an oxygen and to a hydroxyl, an OH. And these two groups allow the amino acids to link together in using covalent bonds, which are these strong bonds that we looked at. So it allows these amino acids to link together to form these long chains of amino acids. And the side group, that little red group up top, is variable. So you can have different kinds of side groups. And depending on the side group, you have different properties. So here you can see that each of these amino acids, which are real examples of amino acids, have different side groups that are highlighted in purple. And so there's 20 different amino acids, which really means that there's 20 different of these side groups. And each of the amino acids are going to have unique properties based on their side group. So depending on the side group, some amino acids are going to be more bulky, some are going to have negative or positive charges, some are going to be polar, which means they have slightly negative or positive charges, right? If you have oxygen or nitrogen, we talked about electronegativity when we talked about water. So oxygen and nitrogen, they pull electrons toward themselves. Sulfur does this too. So that atom, the oxygen, nitrogen, or sulfur, will have a slightly negative charge. And then the hydrogen that's attached to it is going to have a slightly positive charge. So you have polar amino acids as well. And I don't expect you guys to know all these, but the two tables in these two, this slide and the next slide, just show you the different properties of the functional groups of the amino acids. So depending on the functional group, some amino acids will be nonpolar, some will be polar, but they don't have an overall negative or positive charge. And then some of them are actually going to have a charge, either a negative charge or a positive charge. And these are all amino acids that are non-aromatic, which means they don't form a ring structure. On the top here, you have amino acids that do form rings, and they're called aromatic. And you have nonpolar, polar uncharged, and charged amino acids. And then you also have a few amino acids that have special functions. So this is just to give you the idea, the understanding that amino acids have different properties based on their functional groups, right? Those groups in this case that are highlighted in yellow. Okay, so we said a protein's shape determines its function. But what determines the shape or the structure of a protein? Right? If the shape determines the function, what determines the shape? So to understand that, we have to understand that there's three levels of protein structure. There's a primary structure, which is simply the amino acid sequence. And that's exactly what it sounds like. It's the sequence of each amino acid in that protein. There's a secondary structure, which results from the interaction of amino acids in that amino acid chain. And they can interact to form structures called beta sheets or alpha helixes, which you can see in the figure here on the slide. And we'll look at we'll look at it more in depth in a few slides. And then lastly, there's a tertiary structure, which is the overall shape of the protein. So the alpha helixes and beta sheets will kind of fit together in a certain way to give the overall structure of the protein. And sometimes you have protein complexes that are made up of more than one protein, and the shape of these multiple proteins coming together form the quaternary structure. So let's look at each of these levels in detail. So the primary structure is a sequence of amino acids that make up the polypeptide chain. And by polypeptide chain, if you break that down, poly means many, peptide is simply two or more amino acids linked together. And so it's just a chain of amino acids. So polypeptide chain is another word for protein. And it's the sequence of amino acids that determines the overall shape of the protein. So ultimately, that final shape is dependent on this sequence of amino acids. And if you were to change an amino acid in that sequence, say you were to change the 10th one in that sequence to another one, it would affect the overall shape of the protein. So if I ever ask you guys what determines the overall shape of the protein, you would say the primary structure. And you can see there on the left figure, it's just a chain of amino acids. If you zoom in, you'll see that each amino acid has that structure that we talked about, that has an amino group on the left, a carboxyl group on the right, and a side group on the either top or bottom, and it's designated with the R. An R group is another word for a side group, and they're all bonded to that central carbon. And it's just many amino acids linked together. And the bond that links these amino acids together is called a peptide bond. Okay, and these amino acids then can interact, the functional groups in these amino acids. Remember, by functional groups here, really I'm talking about the carboxyl group and the amino group. All right, and these are going to interact to form two structures, two main shapes. Beta sheets, which you can see there on the left, which is when amino acids just interact in parallel, and alpha helixes, you can see there on the right, which is when the amino acids interact to form like a helix or a spiral. And as you can see in the picture, you can see that these structures, these shapes, are held together by these little bonds, the dotted lines in red. And so I'll give you a second to think about it. What bonds do you think those are? And notice it's always between the red ball, the red atom, and the white atom. And these happen to be oxygens and hydrogens. So you should by now have picked up that these are hydrogen bonds. So hydrogen bonds, they're important for water molecules interacting together. They're important for DNA, the double helix holding the two strands together. We saw that the bases in each strand interact with each other using hydrogen bonds. And now we're seeing that they're important in protein structure. So the secondary structure is dependent on these hydrogen bonds. All right, and then these two shapes, the beta sheets and the alpha helixes, will kind of fit together to give the overall shape of the protein, the tertiary structure. So this final shape is formed when the side groups of amino acids that are forming the beta sheets, the alpha helixes, and the amino acids that don't form those structures, when they interact. And so they'll interact and kind of fold the protein into its final shape. And you can see here just different kinds of interactions between amino acids. You have hydrogen bonds. You have something called a disulfide bridge, which is just when two sulfurs interact together. So sulfurs that are in two different amino acids, when they interact together. You have ionic bonds, which we looked at in our last online lecture. So when two charged atoms interact together, so there you can see there's a positive charge on the NH3 and a negative charge on the oxygen, and so those will interact together. They'll attract each other. And then there's something called van der Waals attraction on the far right, which is just a weak bond, a weak force that can hold two atoms together, two molecules together. So anyway, all of these different kinds of interactions will bring the beta sheets and the alpha helixes together to give it this final shape. Another thing also that's playing a role in giving a shape is that all of the hydrophobic functional groups or side groups of the amino acids, remember hydrophobic is water-fearing, all of those are going to clump together in the center. So here in this figure you see this green shaded area that's at the core of the protein. So those are all of the hydrophobic side groups of amino acids that clump together to hide from the water. Because remember, proteins are in cells and they're just floating in the water inside a cell. Right? Each cell has a liquid matrix or a liquid gel inside that's mostly water. So as the proteins are, after a protein is made, all of the hydrophobic functional groups hide in the center, and that helps also give the protein its final shape. And so here again you have the tertiary structure. So you can see in the figure to the right that you have alpha helixes, which are the spirals. You have beta sheets, which are those kind of wrinkled sheets that are parallel to one another, and those will come together and fit a certain way depending on the interactions between the side groups of the amino acids. Alright, so let's watch a video that's going to put all of this together and hopefully help you understand what's going on.
The primary structure of a protein is the linear sequence of amino acids as encoded by DNA. The amino acids are joined by peptide bonds, which link an amino group and a carboxyl group. A water molecule is released each time a bond is formed. Specific amino acid sequences give proteins their distinct shapes and chemical characteristics. These protein chains often fold into two types of secondary structures stabilized by hydrogen bonds. A protein chain can fold into a rigid alpha helix, forming regular patterns of hydrogen bonds between the backbone atoms of nearby amino acids. Backbone atoms of the chain can interact side by side to form beta sheets. Many proteins fold into a compact globular shape, with hydrophobic side chains sheltered inside away from the surrounding water. The functions of many proteins rely on this folded structure. For instance, hemoglobin forms a pocket to hold heme, a small molecule with an iron atom in the center that binds oxygen. Two or more polypeptide chains can come together to form one functional molecule with several subunits. The four subunits of hemoglobin cooperate so that the complex can pick up more oxygen in the lungs and release it in the body.
All right, and so there you can see kind of the three-dimensional structure of that hemoglobin molecule, which is made up of 4 different proteins in pink, blue, orange, and yellow. And the last thing I want to touch on as far as protein structure is what happens when a protein loses its structure. And this is called denaturation. And if you break that word down, de means to remove something, and then naturation is just the natural shape of the protein. So you can think of it as removing the natural shape of the protein. And as you can see in this figure here, you have a properly folded protein. So this protein has formed its secondary structure and its tertiary structure, and then it loses its shape. So now it's just a spaghetti strand of that polypeptide chain. And remember, a protein's shape determines its function. So if you lose the shape, by denaturation, you're going to lose the function. So whenever you disrupt the bonds that are holding that protein together, you're going to kill the function of that protein or modify the function of the protein. And this happens when the protein is subjected to high levels of temperature. So for example, when you're heating up an egg, when you're cooking eggs or cooking meat or anything for that matter, and you see a change in color or a change in texture, what's happening is that you're denaturing all of the proteins in that food and causing those proteins to stick together. So that's why an egg white normally is clear. It has proteins like albumin and other proteins. when you heat those up, they lose their function and they all just kind of stick together, which is why that egg white becomes solid. Also, high pH. So if you subject a protein to very acidic substances, it'll actually denature the protein. I don't know if any of you guys have ever eaten ceviche or know of ceviche, but it's actually a Peruvian dish, originates from Peru, and it's where you cook fish in lemon juice, which is acidic. So those of you that have eaten it, you're not eating raw fish, you're actually eating cooked meat. It's just not cooked with temperature, with heat, it's cooked with acid, with a low pH. Okay, and so again, the message here, the take-home message is that the structure of a protein determines its function. If you lose that structure, you lose the function. All right, so let's look at lipids, and we'll end this chapter. So lipids are a loosely defined group of molecules that share a common characteristic, mainly that they're hydrophobic, water-fearing. And another thing that is unique about lipids is that they're not polymers. So unlike carbohydrates, nucleic acids, and proteins, they are not made up of the same unit that is repeated over and over and over. They are not polymers. There's three main groups of lipids that I want you guys to be aware of. There are fats, which are triglycerides. Triglycerides because you have a glycerol group there, that yellow head, that yellow ball, that's attached to three fatty acid tails, also called hydrocarbons because it's just carbon and hydrogen tails. A chain of carbons bonded to hydrogens. So a triglyceride. This is the fat that you eat in olive oil and bacon fats. These are triglycerides. You also have steroids, which are these ring-shaped lipids that are involved in signaling. So cholesterol, testosterone, estrogen, these are all steroids. And then you have phospholipids, which are lipids that form the cell membrane, the skin of the cell, right? This is actually the example we used when we were talking about an emergent property. Okay, so do certain foods affect your behavior? This is summarizing chapter 2. One of the questions that this chapter started off with was this. So, does sugar make you hyperactive? Does turkey make you drowsy? And there have been studies that have been done on this, and there's just evidence that's out there that suggests that this isn't true, that the evidence does not support these food myths. So, for example, if you look at the amount of tryptophan, which is what people say makes you drowsy when you eat turkey, so that turkey has high levels of tryptophan. Turkey actually has the same amount of tryptophan as chicken, beef, and actually less than eggs and pork. So, it's not that turkey makes you sleepy. The thought is that you eat so much during Thanksgiving that's what makes you sleepy. So when your stomach expands, it actually kicks in, tells your brain, hey, it's time to take a nap. And that's just how your body works. So that's probably what's going on. It's not that turkey has more tryptophan and that makes you sleepy. That's just a myth. And you'll be surprised at how many myths are out there. All right, so let's start. We'll briefly enter into chapter 3 and continue this on Tuesday. So let's talk about nutrients. I think this is a cool part of your textbook because there's a lot of myths out there as far as nutrients go, like what you supplement with vitamins and minerals and how you consume your proteins and carbs. So there's a few cool things that I want to point out here. It's interesting. Americans spend $6 billion a year. I didn't know this. This is all your textbook. On nutritional supplements, right? So like if you go to any grocery store, they'll have a big aisle of supplements like vitamins and minerals and other things. And 2/3 of the American population take at least one supplement. But do they actually improve health and athletic performance? Let's look at that. Nutrients are simply substances in foods, right? It's stuff that provides structural materials or energy for your cells. Macronutrients are nutrients that are required in large amounts. So water, carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. You have three of the organic macromolecules we looked at are macronutrients, things that you need to consume. So water, it's important because it disperses nutrients throughout the body. So your circulatory system, blood is actually made up mostly of water. So water is what helps blood flow through to the different parts of your body so that cells can get nutrients and oxygen. And it dissolves and eliminates waste products, which you pee out, right? And you ultimately lose 3 liters of water a day in sweating, in your urine, and in your feces. So half of that is replaced by the food you eat, because the food you eat contains water. And then the other half you need from other sources. So you need to drink water, right? Or tea, just you need to drink liquids. If not, you're going to get dehydrated, and that's going to make you feel crappy. So if any of you guys suffer from constant headaches or constant drowsiness, it might be because you're dehydrated. A fun little question: is bottled water cleaner than tap water? It's false. It's not. The scientific evidence, or not the scientific evidence, just the interesting thing is that the standards for water quality in your tap water are the same standards for water quality in bottled water. So theoretically, at the bare minimum, there is no difference. Maybe tap water has a little more stuff than bottled water, but not by much. Tap water in the US is pretty clean. So don't be afraid to drink tap water. So macronutrients, carbohydrates are the main energy source in cells. It's the cells in your body, they're mainly powered by glucose, which is a type of carbohydrate. It's a monosaccharide, which means one sugar. Complex carbohydrates are branching chains of simple sugars. So it's glucose that binds together to form these long chains that are branching and that are complex in structure. And these are going to be digested more slowly. So for example, starch, which are carbohydrates from plants, complex carbs from plants, found in potatoes and many other vegetables, and glycogen, which are complex carbs from animals. So plants store carbohydrates for kind of intermediate term storage in starch. Animals do that in glycogen. And you can see here in the figure, you have a grape flavored drink and grapes. They both ultimately, what gives them their sweetness is fructose, which is a monosaccharide, a simple sugar. So you can get fructose from either of these, but the thing is that it's going to be a lot healthier to consume fructose in grapes because you're getting all of the other nutrients that are found in grapes. When you consume it in a drink, in an artificial drink, you're just removing all of the good stuff and you're left with a ton of sugar, which is not great for you. Proteins, as we looked at, are polymers of amino acids. So we said there's 20 amino acids. There's 9 of those that are essential amino acids. It's amino acids that cannot be made in your body, and therefore you must consume from food. You must obtain it from food. Complete proteins, as far as proteins that you're eating, contain all of the essential amino acids, right? So most animal meat is going to be a complete protein. It means that it's going to have all of the essential amino acids that you need to consume, the 9 amino acids you need to consume. Plants are typically not complete proteins. I think the only complete proteins that you can find in plants are soy. So if you eat soybeans or tofu, anything that's made out of soy, soy has all of the 9 essential amino acids, but it doesn't have them in the right quantities that your body needs. Quinoa, which some of you might have heard of, it's a grain from the Andes in Peru. I'm going to pump up Peru as much as I can here. Quinoa is also a complete protein. And the cool thing about quinoa is that it has those 9 essential amino acids in the right amounts that your body needs. So what's interesting is that plants typically, like we said, don't contain the 9 essential amino acids, except for a few of them, like soy and quinoa. So for a vegetarian to obtain the 9 essential amino acids that their body needs, which all of us need these 9 essential amino acids. If you don't consume them, you die, literally, because your body can't make them. So in order for a vegetarian to consume all of the 9 essential amino acids, vegetarians have to eat a variety of plants so that together they can be combined to make a complete protein. Oh, and also just a quick note. So here the figure you have protein shake bottles on the left, and then chicken and broccoli on the right. They all have protein, right? The point being made here is that it's always best to eat to get your protein from whole foods, from natural sources. When you drink, if you are and if you exercise regularly and you're eating protein shakes or drinking protein shakes, not the best source of protein because you isolate the protein from all the other good nutrients and vitamins found in the whole foods. And also, typically, protein shakes, they add in a lot of sugar and a lot of stuff that you don't need to be putting in your body. So it's not the best source of protein for you. All right, and then fats. We actually didn't mention this in the last lecture, but fats are energy storage molecules. So they contain a lot of energy. You can pack in a lot of energy into a fat molecule, more than you can into any carbohydrate. So fats are, they're good when you need a long-term storage of energy, right? So I have a good storage around my mid-waist, my midsection, and whenever my body is going to need extra energy, it's going to start burning those fats for energy. And also, fats act as a cushion. So in your brain, you have fat that surrounds your brain that cushions it, and an insulator, so it keeps you warm if it's too cold outside. And like we mentioned, it consists of a glycerol head, they're in yellow, attached to 3 fatty acid tails. And fatty acids are just hydrocarbons, chains of carbon that are bound to hydrogens. And you also, just like proteins, you have essential fatty acids that you need but you cannot make in the body, like omega-3 and omega-6. So that's why we are encouraged to eat fish, because fish are a good source of these fats. So make sure you're eating some fish, or I think there's some eggs also that have omegas in them. So a fatty acid tail contains carbon that is double bonded to hydrogen. Which description applies to this structure? This is an example of a saturated fat. The double bonds flatten the structure. This is an unsaturated fat and would be liquid at room temperature, or this would be a solid at room temperature. This is testing whether you've read up on the chapter or not, because remember, it is important to read before the lectures so that you're not totally lost and you kind of know where you are. The right answer here is if you have a triglyceride, a fat molecule that has a fatty acid tail that contains a double bond, this is an unsaturated fat. And unsaturated fats are liquid at room temp. So let's look at this. You have 2 types of fats, saturated and unsaturated. Saturated fats, like the name suggests, are the hydrocarbon tails, the fatty acid tails are saturated in hydrogens. So you can see that each carbon in that chain, in the little zoomed in circle, is bound to 2 hydrogens. So each carbon is binding to as many hydrogens as it can. It's saturated in hydrogens. This makes the fatty acid tail stiff, and it makes each fat molecule, it makes all the fat molecules able to pack together really tight, which is why saturated fats are solid. So when you think of saturated fats, think of butter, bacon fat, most animal fats are going to be saturated fats. And then you have unsaturated fats. The main thing is that the carbons, not all of the carbons in the fatty acid tails are saturated with hydrogen. So if you look at the little zoomed in circle, you can see that here you have a carbon that's double bonded to another carbon. So it's not it's not using all of its bonds, as many bonds as possible, to bind with hydrogen. Here it's two of the bonds are binding to another carbon. So this double bond is like a kink in the chain, and it's gonna it's there so they're the fatty acetals aren't going to be straight. They're going to be kind of kinky. And so when you put them all together, they're not going to pack in really tight. So they're going to be liquid at room temperature. And this is mainly what you find in vegetable fats or vegetable oils. Olive oil, vegetable oil, they're liquid at room temperature. So obviously it's a lot easier to get fats from plants than it is from animals, right? Because plants grow abundantly. Animals takes a lot more energy to raise a pig or a cow to get fat from that animal. So the food industry has found a way to make unsaturated fats, which are vegetable oils, into saturated fats. So they do this by hydrogenation, which is a process of adding hydrogen atoms to unsaturated fats, so to vegetable oils, in order to make it solid. So an example of this is margarine, right, which was huge back in the day because people thought that vegetable oils were healthier than animal fats, which isn't entirely true. Um, and and now we know, though, that this is not great, that these hydrogenated fats are actually pretty bad for you. Um, and another fat that's bad for you is called a trans fat. And these are fats that are produced by incomplete hydrogenation. So the double bonds are flat and not kinked. And the main thing is that these fats, these trans fats, have been linked or have been shown. There's a correlation shown with increased health risks such as clogged arteries, heart disease, and diabetes. And so these trans fats are typically the fats you find in fast food, like the Wendy's Baconator here on this slide, or donuts and French fries. And this is one of the main reasons that fast food is terrible for you, is because it's loaded with these trans fats, which are correlated to really deadly diseases, right? So try to limit your intake of fast food. I know we're all in college. I mean, I lived on fast food, but I encourage you guys nonetheless to maybe try eating some more whole foods. Micronutrients. So micronutrients are nutrients required in small quantities, like vitamins, minerals, and antioxidants. So vitamins are organic. Remember, organic means they have carbon, hydrogen, and a few other atoms that are common to all life. And they're organic substances that help enzymes function well. We'll learn exactly what an enzyme is in the next unit, but they're proteins that do stuff. Minerals are inorganic, so they are typically not made of carbon and hydrogen. They're things like zinc and magnesium. They're inorganic substances that help. They have different functions, like they help muscles contract, they help neurons fire, and they help bones grow healthy. And antioxidants help protect cells. So we'll actually look at antioxidants a little more in depth. These micronutrients are not broken down by the body, and they're not burned for energy. So they are just there to help proteins and help cells do their thing, but they're not an energy source. So antioxidants were all the rage a decade ago because it was shown that these antioxidants could prevent cells from damage by free radicals. Free radicals are just molecules that can damage DNA and arteries and membranes. So we make free radicals just naturally. When your cells divide and they do work, you make free radicals. And so antioxidants help sequester them, like capture them, so that they can't wreak havoc in your cells. And these antioxidants are most beneficial when you consume them in whole foods, just like every other nutrient that we've looked at so far. So things like beta-carotene, flavonoids found in chocolate, lycopene found in tomatoes. There's also a bunch of antioxidants in blueberries and strawberries. All these things, better if you consume them in the whole foods rather than supplement with antioxidants that you buy in a bottle. All right, that's the main, I guess, message that your textbook makes with all this that I completely agree with. So, how might processed foods be described? Processed foods are foods that have been stripped of most of their nutritional value, foods that have not been stripped of their nutritional value, foods that are also called roughage and cannot be digested, or foods that have additional vitamins and minerals added. And remember, processed foods are any food that you're going to find packaged in the grocery store. And A is the right answer. So most packaged foods, processed foods, have been stripped of most of their nutritional value. And this happens because the packaged foods on the shelves, things that are made of processed flour or processed sugar, they're basically, we basically isolate that flour, sugar, whatever the processed nutrient is from the whole food, from wheat or from sugar cane, and strip away all the other nutrients that are normally found there. And so people that eat processed foods are deficient in a lot of the nutrients that your body needs. So processed foods are characterized by extensive refinement, they're stripped of nutritional value, and whole foods are any unprocessed food, anything that grows on the earth, and typically these will not be stripped of nutrition. All right, so we'll end here. We'll actually go into cells. I was going to cover some of cells on this online lecture, but we're already over 30 minutes, so I don't want to keep you here much longer. So we'll just start with cells on our Tuesday lecture. Remember that homework for Chapter 2 will be due by Friday night, so make sure you spend 15 minutes working on the homework, and make sure to read up to on the cells part of Chapter 3. All right, guys. Have a great weekend, and I'll see you on Tuesday. Email me with any questions. Bye.